experiencing the atrocities, the freedom to live out their belief, the freedom to educate their children the way they felt. And he spoke up pretty strongly against the Nazi, probably saved their lives, because if they had not spoken out so strongly, emigrated up here to the United States in 1950, styles looking for a way of peace. So that's shortly our story. But today we want to hear mostly from our panel. We do things to address the problems that lead up to together, standing up for each other with that covenant, that promise that we will do good to our neighbor, we will love our enemy. That is really the heart of what following Jesus is. And specializes in human rights, in education, and training to promote peace and pluralism worldwide.
And so our work promotes this idea that everyone should then have the freedom to live out their conscience around the world. But as all of you know, we see all around the world that this freedom is really one of the freedoms that is at most risk, more than any other freedom in the world. And when this freedom goes, as the saying goes, so goes other freedoms. When I previously, before starting my company, as you mentioned, I worked for the U.S. Congress. And when I was there between 2004 and 2010. And as all of you know, that was really at the height of the Iraq War. And for the early years of the Iraq War, I just want to share a little bit of a story and overview. During the early years of the war, religion was never really considered as a major issue in the resolution to the conflict in Iraq. And I remember in 2004 being at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and trying to get people involved in the U.S. government and our policy in Iraq to take it seriously, that we maybe should make religious freedom a red line, maybe we should care about this. And time again, it was an uphill battle. In 2007, when I went to work for the U.S. Congress and started the Religious Freedom Caucus, we began to hold hearings on the religious dimension of conflict. And for 3 years up to that point, it had really been ignored. And from 2007 to 2010, we saw attack after attack after attack on the religious minority communities across Iraq. So the Mandaean community, that at once had been over 50,000 members prior to the Iraq War, by the time 2007 rolled around, there were less than 5,000 members still there, and it's now on the verge of erasure. A few years later, we saw what happened to the Yazidi and the Christian communities when ISIS came in. Communities that historically had created this vibrant, pluralistic society across Iraq were literally on the verge of erasure. And for year after year after year, being a part of the U.S. government and trying to say, hey, we should do something to protect these religious minorities, to be concerned about the freedoms and the rights they have, it was extremely frustrating for me to see that it was never given the priority or the attention that it deserved. And it's heartbreaking for me because I felt so handicapped and just disempowered that paralyzed, I couldn't do anything to help them. And I know that that's how many of us feel in this space of religious freedom when you see people suffering around the world and you want to do something and you want people to care and they don't. So after many years on the Hill, I felt that it was important to start a company that would actually address the root cause of the conflict, the religious red line, as I call it, because without embedding in the culture a respect for freedom of conscience and belief and religion for all people, whether they agree with you or not, you will never have any other freedom. And that's why the Holocaust happened, and many people were rounded up because they disagreed with the Holocaust and the things that the Nazis were doing, because they couldn't control their conscience, so they had to shut them down. And so in Iraq, in 2012-13, my company began to look at ways to go back in, and then ISIS happened. And ISIS, as we all know, literally rounded up people and slaughtered the Yazidis immediately, gave Christians 24 to 48 hours to flee, and then they took the children in the areas that they lived under and they brainwashed them to hate and kill people that believe differently. And we were all watching. And I can tell you, I was actually 5 months pregnant, and I got on a plane because many of the communities that had looked to me for help in Congress, that I tried to give voice to, but never felt like I could sufficiently help, said, Tina, please come help. We're dying, we feel like flies, that we're just getting swatted. Please do something. So I went over there, I was pregnant, and we began to meet with the religious leaders in the communities, and we found a way that we could bring these leaders together and teach them about their fundamental human rights, their dignity, their freedom, and help them begin to embed these values in their culture to speak up for themselves. In religious freedom and the advocacy space, one of the most frustrating things, having worked in Congress, is that we feel like we're on this proverbial hamster wheel that you can never get off of. You're constantly responding to conflict. And so when I started Hardwired, the whole point was to get off the wheel and to empower people locally to be able to stand up for their rights themselves. So we began with these trainings to teach the local, the lawyers, the advocates in the different religious and ethnic communities how to fight for themselves, how to defend their own rights. And what's amazing is that you don't see these huge shifts or changes overnight, but we began to see that they were able to articulate their rights and freedoms through social media, through many different vehicles. And so you started to see this cultural shift that wouldn't have been possible had we not been on the ground actually empowering them to understand their own dignity and freedom and articulate it for themselves. And that's why yesterday when I shared the story that I did about education, our work then led into education and into educating these children and the teachers, training teachers in that space to understand within their own culture and context what religious freedom means and how they can use it and articulate it to change their community and their culture. Because the truth is, when we're talking about religion and war, it's always going to be abused because it's the first line of defense to control someone's conscience, their dignity, their humanity, and their ability to say this is wrong. So that's why we do what we do. That's why we teach people the rights, the dignity, and the freedom they have through legal trainings and education trainings so they can be empowered to defend themselves on the ground, on the front lines, where that is most at risk. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. So now we have Lauren Homer, who is an international lawyer who has counseled U.S. nonprofit and for-profit corporations for over 40 years. But more importantly than that, she has been an international religious freedom advocate for over 30 years, concentrating her work on issues in Russia and other former Soviet republics, China, and Syria. She is a member of the steering committee of the IRF Roundtable and chair of its Middle East working group. So let's welcome Lauren.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be part of this panel, which is about the impact of war on religious freedom. Through a series of events, this was not my area of specialization, but like Tina, I ended up in a situation where I was dealing with ISIS on the behalf of a small group of Syrians who ultimately controlled about 40% of the country, but who lived in the northeast of Syria. And I became intrigued because in 2013, these people got together and created their own autonomous government that they call the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. The reason why they did this was that the Assad regime, you've all heard about Bashar Assad, had sort of abandoned the area, and they knew that these extremists were coming. And they realized, fortunately, that if they didn't band together to defend themselves and figure out a way to govern themselves where they all got along, they were going to be slaughtered, and they almost were slaughtered anyway. But they created, we've talked about covenantal pluralism at this conference. They created a covenant, a social contract, where all the different religious and ethnic groups got together and agreed that they would all have equal rights. They would all affirmatively have the right to participate in the administration of the area. And very significantly for the Middle East, women had equal rights to men. They had a right to 50% of the positions in the parliament. So these were really groundbreaking, earth-shaking, and the defense forces that they ultimately formed were multi-religious and multi-ethnic. And they had even women's divisions, which it turned out that ISIS, as you may know, had as its objective when it formed, and it was a kind of coalition of pre-existing groups, but they wanted to create a worldwide caliphate. So their idea was to eliminate every religion other than the form of Sunni Islam that they wanted people to follow. And it was extremely violent. They had their own book called Management of Savagery in the creation of the worldwide Ummah or Caliphate. And so it had chapters on using rape, using crucifixions, using beheadings and other things, enslavement, who could be enslaved, who could be allowed to convert. And that was their rule book. And I'm sure you all read about how even Sunni Muslims, if they thought they were gay, would be thrown off the top of 5-story buildings. Even being a Muslim was not a guarantee that you'd be able to live. And in the case of Yazidis, they viewed them as less than human, committed terrible atrocities, but they committed a lot against Christians as well. And I don't know whether I should weigh you down with the stories of some of the things that happened to Christians, but there was one group of people who were rounded up, and they were all told they had to convert to Islam, and one young man in particular, who was a teenager, refused. And first they cut off his fingers in front of his own mother, then they beheaded him, and then they did horrible things to her and killed everybody. That was ISIS. So in 2015, after having attacked Sinjar and the Yazidis and a city called Kobani that was mentioned in the program today, they assembled along something called the Khabur River. And they at this point had Iraqi tanks and mortars that the U.S. had given to the Iraqi army that they had captured. And they crossed over into some small Christian villages, took around 360 people captive, and held them for ransom for many, many months, more than a year. And we went to the U.S. government and said, you've got to help. The defenders had rifles and pickup trucks against these modern tanks and other weapons. And fortunately, the Obama administration agreed to help and did airstrikes, and it was really touch and go. It really was a heroic battle because these folks were so poorly armed. But they knew they had to defend their territory. The Iraqi army ran away, the Syrian army ran away from ISIS, but they couldn't because this was their homeland and they had to defend it. And so the U.S. got behind them and eventually convinced them to go all the way after ISIS. And they went all the way and defeated it. And there are more twists and turns to the story that I don't have time to get into, but what we want now is to have justice. We want to have international tribunals for the ISIS soldiers that they're holding so that the world will really know what this was all about. We want Turkey, who invaded, to get out of northern Syria, and we want this model to be used, certainly still by them, no matter what happens, and hopefully for the rest of Syria and other parts of the Middle East. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Lauren. And next we have Pastor Dr. William Devlin, who is down here in the audience, not because he's less important, but because he came late and there wasn't room up here. So come up here, Pastor. Pastor PB, as you're known, is an Infinity's missions pastor.
You don't have to read all
I
that.
don't have to read your whole bio, but
No.
suffice it to say
All
that,
right.
that pastor has a long storied history of working in the ministry around the world, as well as a decorated Vietnam War veteran. So thank you for your service on many fronts.
All right.
I will open the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Am I on mute? Oh, I'm sorry, we're not on Zoom. Okay, yeah. You forget after a year on Zoom, right? So you can hear me okay. Well, let me do the 3 Bs. And thank you, Tina and Lauren. I serve with Lauren on the local IRF committee here, Roundtable. I'm going to do the 3 B's today. You ever heard of the 3 B's? Be brief, be blunt, and be gone. General Sherman. So we're talking about the impact of war on religious freedom, right? And I see we have some teenagers here, right? Some kids. All right. Where are you from? New York. New York City?
There are students from our Bruderhof
okay.
communities up in New York.
All right. Welcome. Welcome. We're glad you're here. I know you're a little shy and bashful, right? So General Sherman, famous Civil War general, said, "War is hell." There was a 1960s song that said, "War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing." The original meaning of war was from the old German, speaking of the Bruderhof. War meant originally to confuse and to mix up. Did you know that? There's war, officially declared war, and then there's war. A lot of the stories you've heard today from Tina and Lauren, these are not declared wars. These are just crazy extremist people that come in and want to kill other people simply because, in the Christian case, they love Jesus. So there's big wars, and then there's small wars. And wherever there is war, there is suppression of religious freedom. You know, think about it. That's why America was founded, because folk were tired of getting suppressed in Europe. So wherever there's war, there's suppression of religious freedom. Think of Syria. Think of the People's Republic of China. Think of Darfur, Nigeria, Nicaragua. The oppressor is oppressing the oppressed. Well, we know the problem, right? You've heard stories since Tuesday night. We know the problem. What's the solution? Let me offer at least my twisted, demented solution to the problem. It's the acronym SAM. Strategic, act, and move. We must be, as lovers and followers of religious freedom, we must act strategically. What's your plan? You're going to hear the plan from these good folks up here. They have a plan, right? What's your plan? We have to act. You're concerned about Leah Sheribu being held? I just came back from Nigeria, and I'm not bringing attention to myself, but I met with the Nigerian government and the U.S. government, and I offered to exchange myself. If Boko Haram would release Leah, I would go in and serve out however long Boko Haram would keep me. That, for me, is a practical application of John 15:13. Greater love is no man than a man lays down his life for his brother or his sister. And then we must move. So get a plan. Bruderhof kids, get a plan. Strategic, act, and move. We must be what I call interventionists. We must be interventionists. And so what is our responsibility to those who are suffering under the boot heel of religious oppression because they want to worship God in their own way? What's our responsibility in the war zone? It's to go. I was pastoring a big church in Manhattan 10 years ago. I was ready to go out of their feet first, meaning, when I died, they would carry me out. And God revealed 3 words to me: God, gospel, and good news. And by the power of the Holy Spirit, God focused my attention on the first 2 letters in all 3 of those words. First 2 letters in the word God are go. Gospel, go. Good news, go. And at that time, Iraq war was going on, boots on the ground. Everybody was saying to President Obama, you need to have boots on the ground. God spoke to me and said, Pastor, where are your boots? So, as interventionists, we must drop in behind enemy lines. We must bring peace. And so God has called many of us to the war zones. What's your plan? Will you strategically act and move? And the criteria that I use, and I've been in 17 countries now, predominantly in the Middle East, Central Asia, and East and West Africa. The place has to be hard, it has to be dangerous, and it has to be where nobody else is going. Like as I was sharing with Bob and Angela last night about our entree into Hong Kong while they were shooting us with rubber bullets, the Hong Kong riot police, tear gas, and water cannons. So we must bring peace. As people of God, we must drop in behind enemy lines, And we must pray for the peace of these areas. Just like Scripture dictates, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I love that verse, the sayings of Jesus. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called what? The children of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So my responsibility, giving up a nice church in Manhattan, New York City, was to go to the war zones, to bring in the peace, and Jesus is the Prince of Peace. As I conclude, as I encourage all of us to be interventionists, I love acronyms. SAM, Strategic, Act, Move. Here's another one for you. I hope you're taking notes there. I practice the ministry of presence. And what does it come out to? M-O-P. What's M-O-P? It's a mop, right? What does a mop do? It cleans up messes. That's the call of God for those of us who are lovers of religious freedom. We have to be mops. So will you come with me to Nigeria? I'm leaving in 2 weeks for Afghanistan. Will you come with me to these war zones? And I'll make a commitment here before the Bruderhof people. If you come with me, I'll pay for a one-way flight. I won't say which way, but I'll pay for a one-way flight. Yeah, we're laughing, but this is serious stuff. Haven't your hearts been broken by the stories you've heard? I mean, I've spent time weeping when I think of Leah, when I think of our Uyghur sister. So let me conclude. I want you to be SAMs, and I want you to be MOPs. I want you to be interventionists. When I went to Nigeria 6 months ago, I stood in the middle of a destroyed church by Boko Haram, by the Fulani Muslims. And I said, I will promise I will rebuild your church. Came back, raised 30,000, rebuilt the church. Same thing when Sri Lankan Zionist evangelical church was blown up, came back, raised 100,000. Let me conclude with a quote from, do you all know Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Listen to what he said. Let this sink into your heart, your soul, your spirit, your brain. Brother Dietrich said this, and he died for his faith. You all know that. Hung by the neck with piano wire in a German Nazi concentration camp. He was hung naked. He didn't even give the dignity of having a cloth over his private parts. And he said this, if I sit next to a madman as he drives a car into a crowd of innocent bystanders, I can't, as a Christian, simply wait for the catastrophe and then comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the demented driver. He also said not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. And finally he said, salvation is free, but discipleship will cost your life. So, let's go, folks, okay? God bless and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gundy. So next we have Angela Wu Howard, who obtained a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford and a J.D. cum laude from Harvard Law School. And she wants me to leave off all her other accomplishments because most importantly right now she is serving with the Beckett Institute, which is a public interest law firm defending people of all faiths. And so her clients have included Buddhists, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Sikhs. Angela, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for having me. And do I really have to follow that? That was really inspiring. Thank you, Pastor Dunham. I'm going to go a little bit further afield, away from sort of the immediate situation of war, and tell you about a case that putatively has nothing to do with war, but might bring us back to some first principles that are actually really important before, during, and after war. So we recently filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is the regional court for the Organization of American States, which is an organization with participation from all of the American states, so Canada, United States of America, Central and South American states. And this case had to do with a a high school teacher of religion who had her certification as a Catholic teacher withdrawn because she was involved in an active homosexual relationship. And the Catholic Church withdrew her certification to teach Catholicism. Now, she didn't lose her job. In fact, she got a promotion at her school, and she was reassigned to teach other subjects. But the Chilean state has this rule that in order to teach religion, you have to be certified by the different religious bodies. So in order to teach Buddhism, you would have to be certified by the Buddhist authorities saying that you're qualified, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in this particular case, she sued basically to have her certification reinstated. Now, what in the world does this have to do with war? Well, I think this case points back to a very fundamental principle, one of the first principles that undergird religious freedom in general, and that's religious autonomy. And what is religious autonomy? It's the freedom of religious individuals and organizations, so individuals as a collective, to act freely and according to their conscience and without punishment. And fundamental to that is the ability to freely choose your own preachers and teachers. And that was really what was at the heart of this case, and not necessarily something that you would see in the very beginning. It sounds, because it has something to do with sexual morality, it sounds a little bit more like what we in America think of as a culture war case. But I don't actually think that that's what was at stake in this case, or that's what is at stake in this case. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to bring the court's attention to how the principle that was at stake here, the freedom of religious organizations to choose their own teachers and preachers, would affect people in different circumstances. So they were thinking of it in terms of discrimination against the LGBTQ community. And I really have to say that the LGBTQ community does suffer horrific discrimination and persecution in many parts of the world, and they deserve protection, they deserve the recognition of their inherent human dignity. In this particular case, what was also happening, aside from an employment discrimination question, and whether it actually was discrimination, was the freedom of the Catholic Church to choose its own teachers and preachers. So we were asked by an interested party to file a brief on behalf of religious minorities from around the world who could explain to the court that religious autonomy is actually an existential issue for us. And we were able, actually with the help of some of the people in the audience here from the Institute of Global Engagement and Tina at Hardwired, to pull together about a dozen people from different communities around the world in different countries to sign a brief essentially saying religious autonomy is really, really important to us. And when that principle is undermined anywhere in the world, it gives cover for governments that we are trying to fight in terms of the restrictions that they're placing on us to continue to do that kind of thing. And one of the signatories was actually the Bruderhof community. And as Pastor Heinrich mentioned earlier, the Bruderhof community came out of World War I, aiming to be a community that was a signpost to the kingdom of God, and to a particular way of living that would be hopeful and peaceful. But between World War I and or at the very beginning, right before World War II, they actually experienced having to basically ship all of their children out of Germany because the Nazis shut down their school because they were unwilling, the Bruderhof school, because they were unwilling to allow the German National Socialist government to inculcate their children. So they were unwilling to inculcate their children in Nazi ideology, and their school was shut down, and subsequently the entire community was shut down. And I didn't know this history when we started pulling together this particular brief. But as Tina was saying, the loss of religious autonomy really is the canary in the coal mine of sort of the dissembling of a social fabric and social order. And when you see regimes start to attack religious autonomy and this fundamental principle, it really is one of the first signs of this kind of dissembling. And I think that that's why even in jurisdictions like Chile or in some of the inter-American states where you don't see this kind of high degree of conflict, we actually need to be paying attention to this kind of thing. The second thing that I'll talk about is what happens after war. So a lot of times in post-war recovery, religious communities are actually really crucial. And this is also something that I think in a secularized world isn't always recognized. So religious communities really transcend the nation state, right? Their bonds go beyond the bonds of civil government and civil enforcement of civil law. And so when there is war or large trauma or even sometimes natural disaster that visits the same kind of chaos on a particular society, so my husband's in international humanitarian work, and some of the first people that he looks to partner with on the ground are religious leaders. You look for the imams, you look for the pastors, because they know where people are. They know who's missing, they know who to look for, they know what the fundamental needs of the community are, in a way that civil society and the state government sometimes will not be able to track at all, because they are part of very deep relationships. And those relationships that are developed in religious communities offer a value to society that is often overlooked. So it's not just the great volume of charitable, time and money that religious communities offer to society, although there is certainly that. It's that there are many different kinds of conflicts that religious communities, because of the relationships they have that feed into the trust that's needed for conflict resolution, it's that value that they're bringing. So that's something that they can do to prevent war, and after war, or any kind of a trauma, it's something that they can present that really state governments and apparatuses, although they can be partners in this, if they have the right posture, that they cannot offer. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Angela. Now we have the pleasure to hear from the Reverend Dr. Bob Fu, who is one of the leading voices in the world for persecuted communities, faith communities in China. And Bob has a very interesting history in China, where he led the student movement in Tiananmen Square and was a house church leader. And he and his wife were imprisoned for their faith in 1996 and eventually exiled here to the United States. In 2002, he founded China Aid, based in Philadelphia, which promotes religious freedom and the rule of law in China. And Bob has spoken at many events, and it's a great privilege to have you today. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to speaking along with my friends and heroes and fellow colleagues back to 15 years ago. Or switch microphones a bit smaller. Okay. Yeah. Oh. More to that way. So okay. A little bit. Thank you. The impact of a war against the religious minorities. First, there is a war. I mean, it's maybe technically not the old pattern war with the battlefield soldiers there. But after President Xi Jinping took power, basically he launched what I summarized as a war against all the fundamental freedoms, a war against the freedom, especially in three particular fields: a war against religion or any independently perceived religion that is not compatible with the communism is a target of the war. Secondly, a war against the children, especially against the children's education, religious education. And today, I mean, millions of Chinese children, these are believers, Christians especially, are mandated, forced to sign a form to renounce their faith. Otherwise, they will lose their opportunity for education. They will lose even the parents will lose their pension or kind of income. And the war against the rule of law. So I call the three battlefield: the war against faith, especially against those independent faith. Not only one faith, of course, the Protestant house churches, the Catholics, the Buddhists, the Tibetan Buddhists, the Falun Gong practitioners. Of course, today we also have a particular representative from the campaign for Uyghurs. As we'll know, later on, Julie will share on that field. So how can we address this war? The war, is there a solution? Of course, these guys, I look for solutions, and from legal field, from Tina went to the battlefield and walked with them. And China Aid, we are a small Christian organization based in West Texas, a city called Midland, in the middle of nowhere in the desert. But we are also launching war, offensive war, and defensive war in 3 ways. We call it 3 E's. Learn from Pastor Devin, and the expose, encourage, and equip. So expose, very simply, is we want to be a voice for this voiceless. I mean, this is one of the platforms. I mean, for certainly over the years, we traveled to different parliament, from Taiwan to Geneva, from Brussels to Seoul in South Korea, to be a voice, because many times, as a former prisoner of conscience, pastor in the Beijing prison, the first thing, the most encouraging thing when I was in prison during the interrogation time was through an interrogator telling me, it said, haha, Bob, call me Brother Fu or Pastor Fu, many people are caring about you outside the world. He was laughing. He was thinking like, you're in our hands. We can do whatever to you. And although, despite many people, but to me, it means a lot of good angels, a lot of the brothers and sisters like you guys have been praying for me. And that means the whole world. You don't feel lonely anymore. Although I knew, later on, my wife was also in another prison cell in the same prison. I know our prayers are being heard. I know many brothers and sisters are raising their voice. So be a voice. So that we call it expose, encourage, very quickly. So we send funding to those prisoners of conscience. We have a FOP, we call it fund. It's Family Prisoner Fund, thousands of dollars, and we communicate whenever there's a family prisoner. We set up an account, and the Chinese prisoner especially. I got also enlightened when I was the second month in the prison. Suddenly one day a prison guard told me, said, the pastor, they don't call me pastor, but Brother Fu, even so dear to me, and said, in your prison account, you have some money coming in. Somebody deposited some money. Now, today you can order a box, instant noodles. And of course it's very expensive, maybe 10 times more expensive to use your money over there. And that was my 5 courses of a Chinese buffet, the equivalent. So I can use the instant noodles with tap waters and waiting. That is the best meal for my whole prison time. Because one brother risked his life, went to my Beijing prison and deposit 200 yuan over there so I can eat some noodles. So that was the action part. And of course, we also, in the time of urgency, we rescued those brothers and sisters and prisoners from Christian faith, non-Christian faith, even Kazakh Muslims and Chinese doctors who were persecuted. So we just, basically want to encourage them in that way, because one rescue means to not only rescue that family, but also to the other persecuted communities. I mean, the whole Kazakh community were enlightened when we, this February, rescued that Gozira. Some of you heard her testimony, who is one of the very rare couple witnesses witnessing in her own eyes the government organized, systematically forced prostitution inside the camp. It's gun rape, systematically. And so that is we call the encouragement. And the third one is equip. Basically, it tells we have a rule of law and biblical worldview training programs to help the Chinese grassroots leaders, religious leaders, to understand their fundamental rights, both in the international law and the Chinese law, so that they can fight in the court, like Angela has been fighting. And although the Chinese government now, because of the war against the rule of law, those defenders of those defenseless end up in prison. We have China's called the Conscience of China, called Gao Zhisheng, who was tortured 8 years and in the most unspeakable, used like a tooth speck, torture his private parts. And we have, of course, just because he represents Falun Gong practitioners, Christians, in the court of the law. So, expose, encourage, and equip. Join us at the fight. Let's do that together. Advance freedom for all. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pastor Steve. I would like to call up Julie Millsap, who is here to represent the Campaign for the Uyghurs, to hear the story of that atrocity in China.
Thank you so much, and to Pastor Bob Fu for giving a few minutes and encouraging us to speak today and giving us this platform as well. It's personally very meaningful to me because I spent the last decade living in China. My husband is Chinese and our family are there, and we've always closely followed the work of China Aid and been greatly encouraged by it. As a Christian myself, and now involved in Uyghur advocacy, so working with predominantly Muslims. But just as been mentioned here, what's happening to the Uyghurs, and many of you may be familiar, may not be war in the sense that most people think of it, in the literal and declared sense officially. However, I would make the point that actually the Chinese officials have declared war against Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples, using language that I think will be a punch in the gut when you hear things like human problem. Uyghurs have been referred to in official documents and by officials as a human problem, as people who need to be cured of a disease. This type of language, we know what comes from this language and alienation and deliberate differentiations of people as the other. And there are a lot of really literal semblances of things that echo back to the worst parts of history, and it's so meaningful even to hear quotes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of my personal inspirations. But as you know, the Uyghur people in East Turkestan, as well as Kazakhs and other Turkic peoples, are facing what has been referred to rightfully so as active genocide. This is war against civilians. So the CCP's actions to weaponize religion and defame Uyghurs as extremists while waging war on Islam and religion in general is of course tied to the fear of independent thought, and something that's fed into with this deliberate move of people into being the other and deliberately stirring up fear among the Chinese population. So we'll see also, I'm going to briefly talk about how our advocacy actually addresses one of these problems of how war is created. So in addition to herding millions of innocent people into concentration camps and what is essentially modern day slavery, Beijing is announcing openly to the world that they will rewrite the Bible and the Quran to be more in line with communist atheist ideologies as defined by Xi Jinping at present, and to demand uniform ethnic identity and loyalty to Xi and to the party. And so the Uyghurs' religious identity is used as a cover for also some broader goals when we see that the same tactics are also being used against Christians, against Tibetans, against Hong Kong. But of course, this is the most extreme situation at present in terms of physical death. So the Uyghurs' religious identity is being weaponized against them, and the crimes against humanity that are being carried out by the CCP are really too numerous to list, and many of you may have read about them, but just to use these words and remind us. We're talking about forced marriage, mass rape, Orwellian surveillance, forced abortion, mandatory birth control, forced sterilizations, arrests, beatings, tortures that it is very difficult even for someone who works in human rights to listen to people testify to personally. Child abduction, brainwashing, forced organ harvesting, crematoria. Yes, murder. People are dying in these camps. And another aspect of this is the psychological toll that this takes on an entire generation of people. Effectively, they have already been destroyed, to be perfectly honest. And people in the human rights community dealing with immense secondhand trauma. So we see the effects of war right now, at present. And the lack of support, that's a whole other topic I won't get into today, but there are many reasons for that. And one thing that I would like to say, though, is that in spite of the lack of support from the Muslim world and the many reasons for that, China is waging a broader war on democracy and the free world, and it's not going to stop with the Uyghurs. And so that's a big part of our messaging. If China is allowed to get away with this as a last and final wake-up call, just as Tibetans, Southern Mongolians, Hong Kongers, Chinese Christians, and many more have all been targeted and suffered, we have to take a last opportunity to stand together and say that we must defend freedom in our world today, and religious freedom in particular, as war has already been declared against us. So I want to remind that in these dark times, I work with a predominantly Muslim people group, and one thing that I have heard recently is, when the Muslim world abandoned me, I see how the Christians and the Jewish community are standing up and speaking out. And this is not a criticism of Muslims. There are many Muslims who actually are very involved in advocating, but it's to make the point that our way of fighting this war also is to build solidarity, and through events such as this today. So thank you so much. I'm honored to stand together with you and happy to talk more with you after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. And finally, our last speaker today is Trita Parsi, who's an award-winning author, and he's the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And he's also an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations. So welcome, Trita. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here. This is my first physical event since the pandemic, and delighted to actually be able to physically be here with you and learn from these fantastic, oftentimes unfortunately depressing, but extremely, extremely important stories. I have broken a very important rule by being here today, because I do have a rule that says that I should never be on a panel if there's a reverend or a pastor speaking, because no one will never remember what I said after the panel. I'll still do my best to disprove the validity of this rule. Pastor, you mentioned many good things, but one thing that I thought was particularly touching to me is to see the tremendous courage, discipline, and dedication you show by throwing yourself in the front lines, trying to help, as well as you, Reverend. And you mentioned that this is your way of not waiting for disaster to happen, but to take that wheel and make it turn and not go in the wrong direction. I cannot claim that what we are doing is in any way, shape, or form at the level of courage that you all are showing. But we are trying to turn the wheel as well in a manner that we find extremely important, because of the manner in which war, in its traditional sense, I do not deny what you are describing as war, but in its traditional sense, tend to make all of these different things so much worse. The Quincy Institute was founded to move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and towards military restraint and diplomacy. And our vision is a world in which peace is the norm and war is the exception. And part of the reason for this is because we think that these wars have been tremendously bad for the United States and for the world, and it's been particularly bad for religious minorities. I'm myself from a religious minority, although I don't work in the field of religious freedom. I'm a Zoroastrian from Iran. And when we take a look at what has happened in the Middle East in particular for the last 20 years, it is a very depressing picture. Of course, let me just say this very clearly. The type of government-driven discrimination and oppression and persecution that is happening is, of course, condemnable and extremely bad. What we just heard of what's happening in China is absolutely terrible. But it is also important to, just to say, in Iran, for instance, right now, the situation of the Baha'is is particularly problematic, even though Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Sunni Muslims also face significant problems. Most of these cases, though, the discrimination is actually driven by government policy, not by societal attitudes, which is very important to keep in mind. But there is a contradiction that I think we do have to address, and that is that some of the worst, truly worst, authoritarians in the Middle East, under their rule, the rights and the protection of many religious minorities were unfortunately much better than what has been in the governments or the chaos that has come afterwards. Just take a look at the track record. Christians in Libya were 300,000 before the civil war broke out there, and then the NATO intervention that till this day is going on. They are now less than 130,000 Coptic Christians in that country, almost a 2/3 reduction. Iraq was mentioned earlier on. We're talking about a country pre-2003, pre-invasion, 1.5 million Christians. That dropped in 3 years to 700,000. Essentially halving of the number of Christians here. And then once ISIS came out, the number dropped another half and are now somewhat less than 400,000. Syria, of course, is another example in which you had a very large Christian community. Just in the city of Aleppo, which is a very important city for Christians in Syria, the population of Christians have dropped from 200,000 to roughly 30,000, an 85% drop, as a result of a civil war that has been prolonged by interventions by a number of states. Now, this shows the tremendous dangers of military interventions in the past 2 decades for the very survival of Christian and ethnic minorities. Christians in Iraq, just to put this in perspective, have been there for 2,000 years. They have survived the Mongol invasion, the Muslim invasion, but they have hardly managed to survive the invasion of Iraq and the chaos and the aftermath of it. Same thing when it comes to Christians in Libya, who have dwindled by 2/3. In fact, an argument in our view can be made that few things have been as detrimental to religious freedom of minorities in the Middle East than the many interventions, including US military interventions, that oftentimes ostensibly have been done to protect them. As much as stability at times, particularly with these government repressions, can be very suffocating, the absence of stability and the presence of war caused by or reinforced by attempts to socially re-engineer these countries and societies through force from the outside often make the situation of religious minorities much worse. So to help minorities, if we go to root causes or what are the first step, I think we have to be very careful and try to make sure that whatever kinds of pressures are needed and necessary at times, and we work really hard to make sure that we follow the rule of not making things worse and not pushing states and societies towards some form of a collapse. We have a study that comes out on Monday that shows who the countries in the region are that have been the most interventionist. And it's actually a very, very dark picture. The title of the report, No Clean Hands, may tell you the story right there. There's essentially no clean hands, in which almost all of the different countries have intervened in a variety of ways, in a variety of conflicts. One complicating factor, or at least a factor that perhaps will come to the surprise of a lot of people in Washington, is that 5 out of the 6 most interventionist states in the region, militarily interventionist, are armed, funded, and politically and diplomatically protected by the United States. So, and the conclusion of that shows that oftentimes instability drives intervention rather than intervention drives instability. But once instability happens, the interventions tend to make it much worse and prolong it. So as a first step, with whatever pressures we do and need to take, we have to be very careful not to allow the complete collapse of these societies or lead it to war, because after that, there essentially remains only bad options. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Trita, and to all of you panelists. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. We can't entertain more dialogue or questions, which would be wonderful. But the testimonies we heard today, they're heart-wrenching, and we should let them touch us. But it's a call to action. And I think we heard it loud and clear today that an army of mops would be a lot better than an army of guns. And let's go to it. And again, a shout out to you young people from the Bruderhof who interrupted their bike tour of the Capitol to come and listen today. And you are the ones that are going to carry the mops into the future. So let's give them a hand. And we also want to recognize Johan Julian, who put this panel together. Thank you, Johan, for the hard work of that. And thank you again to each of you panelists. Good luck, and God bless you all in your work.